Let me take you back for a moment to the days before emulation was commonplace. To the times before it became viable to publishers to re-release collections of their arcade classics for home systems. In these days, unofficial remakes of arcade classics were commonplace amongst the collections of shareware games released by budding programmers. But of all of them, one company stood out amongst the crowd: Champ Programming. Over several years, they would release a set of shareware takes on classic arcades for DOS PCs, and compared to many of the clones out there, these ones nailed the feelings of the original arcade games and were great fun to play. I may not have gotten to try them all out back in the day, but the quality of those I did try was so high that Champ Programming would be a name I'd never forget. Flash forward many years later to the present day, and as I got back into checking out new Atari 2600 releases, it was quite a welcome surprise to see they'd return as Champ Games. And yes, still continuing to produce new takes on arcade classics, now augmented with the latest in Atari 2600 cartridge technology. Of the many they've done over the last few years, I couldn't help but check out their take on an arcade game I'm quite familiar with: Galagon. If the name doesn't give it away, Galagon is their take on Namco's Galaga, in which you're pitted against the hostile Galaga forces. In each wave, you'll need to clear them out before proceeding on to the next, whilst avoiding their attacks in order to survive. The big mechanic which Galaga brought to the play is the ability for your fighter to be captured by enemy flagships. If you can take out a flagship holding a captured fighter as it descends, the fighter is free, and you'll now double up your firepower, becoming that bit more effective against the enemies. After every few levels, you're presented with a challenging stage. These stages focus less on surviving your way through the enemy barrage, but rather on using your shooting skills. Groups of enemies appear one element at a time, and you'll have to find the right spot to take them out before they escape off screen. Like with any arcade game, the focus here is on earning as high a score as possible, with the best way to do so being incredibly patient. Taking out enemies as they break formation will earn you more points than shooting them whilst they stand still. Taking out the flagships, which have both their escorts present, will earn you even more points than taking them out individually. The biggest points though are earned by successfully clearing out each challenging stage by learning the enemy patterns. Compared to other versions of the game, this is a bit tougher on your first few play attempts thanks to having less time to react to set patterns. Now, if Galagon was simply just Galaga shoved onto an Atari 2600, then this is the point where you could say mission accomplished and move on. But that would be a great disservice. First up, you've got selectable difficulty levels. The default standard level aims to match the difficulty of the original arcade machine. This is the mode I spent the bulk of my time with in recording this video, and from my experiences, once I had a few plays under my belt, my scores in Galagon tended to be about the same as on the original game. If that doesn't convince you it's tightly balanced, then I don't think anything will. Turning things down to Device lets the difficulty ramp up at a much slower rate, which is great for giving you some breathing room when you're getting started. Along with that, you'll also start out with having the dual ship upgrade ready to go, which also helps ease the challenge as a result. Then, there's Advanced Mode. This one ratchets things up to 11, making enemies both move faster and be more aggressive to deal with. Along with that, as they fly into the stage, there'll be even more of them in the formations. For those who are after a serious challenge, this is the mode for you. But for someone like me, it happened to wipe me out incredibly quickly. The best mode is the one I've saved for last though, Challenge Mode. Here, you'll work your way through each of the game's challenging stages, with the goal being to take out all the enemies in each. Succeed, you'll earn an extra ship and move on to the next. Miss even one, and you'll be penalised. This can range from just losing your double ship or maybe one of your reserve lives. do poorly enough though, and you'll lose both. Though not quite as challenging as Advanced Mode, I find the Challenge Mode a great addition to Galagon, taking these core mechanics of the challenging stages and reworking how they're played to create something different, truly adds something which you'll certainly want to come back to. Another reason for this is simply that many players won't have seen those challenging stages when playing the main game, so you get a chance to see something a little fresh as a result. It's also a great one to use in high score challenges, if only because of how short and frantic those games can be. What also adds to Galagon is the multiplayer modes it offers. Now, sadly, I did not get a chance to try these out when putting this video together, and one of them sounds real interesting, that being the cooperative 2-player mode, which joins a more traditional alternating turns mode where player 1 plays, then player 2 plays, and so on. Yes, cooperative mode, in a game riffing on Galaga. It sounds weird, at least based on how it's presented in the manual, but it's another great way of adding some extra dimensionality to the game's mechanics. And the freedom to add features like this is what I find always makes home takes on arcade classics that little bit more interesting to play than just getting the original game and playing it under emulation. Both the addition of this cooperative 2-player mode and challenge mode offer a lot of reasons to go back to Galagon. Whether you just want to sit down and try and beat your top scores or want something to enjoy with some friends, it really does give you that experience. And on top of that, if you happen to have a save key or Atari box connected, Galagon will save your scores to it. It's that proverbial cherry on the cake in terms of both the polish and thought which has gone into making Galagon such a wonderful package. And besides, what good is a score-chasing game without having a feature to save your best score, right? Right? Exactly. Visually, Galagon pushes the Atari 2600 hard, and then some. When in formation, enemy sprites are nicely coloured and well drawn, giving you the feeling of the arcade game's visuals, despite the limitations of the 2600 hardware. Once they break free of formation though, things do change a bit as they now become monochromatic, which might be jarring on first sight, but when you think about it, kind of makes sense because of how dynamic their movements are, especially when you compare things to other Atari 2600 releases. Something which might throw potential players off, particularly those who happen to be like me and are going to play Galagon on a modern flat panel display, is the sprite flicker. You'll find it most apparent during the early phases of each stage as formations appear on screen. Now, this might just be a case of how I process things, but I found the flicker to be distracting after a point, and honestly I think it helped me lose a life or several in some of my attempts at the game. That is my experience, however, and you might find things different. I know some of this has been controversial in the past when I've raised it. If you so happen to be fortunate enough to be able to play Galagon on a CRT television or monitor, then it's likely not going to be as much of a problem for you. In fact, you're quite lucky to be able to enjoy it in that way. If there was something I was going to nominate as a weak point for Galagon, it's the sound. The truth is, whilst it does the job, the 2600's TIA chipset just isn't really great for the kinds of sound this game needs. The explosion effects don't quite channel that classic Atari explosion sound, though both the general enemy effects and shot sounds are more than up to the task. The jingles suffer most of all here simply because the TIA does not have the musical range which is needed to approximate them properly. I'm not really surprised by that, even as short as they are when it comes down to it. Despite this, I don't think it detracts all that much. You're not really playing Galagon for its audio. Its effects do the job, and they're not quite memorable like you'd expect in other games of the time. So, the fact that they serve their purpose and aren't magically inspiring isn't too much of a problem, at least how I see it. So as it stands, I absolutely would say Galagon is an excellent release for the Atari 2600. It takes an arcade game which, quite frankly, was never going to work on the system, and manages to make it happen. Yes, it's only possible thanks to modern cartridge hardware, just like with Draconian, which I covered on the channel not too long ago. But that shouldn't discount the achievement. Even with the extra processing power in the cartridge, it still requires a keen eye to adapt the design and mechanics, along with plenty of technical understanding to know just how to push the hardware to its limits and make something which is incredibly fun to play. If you want to check Galagon out, and I recommend you do, it's available both as a digital download from the Champ Games website and on cartridge through Atari Age. As with many modern Atari 2600 releases, if you're running a PAL console, as I am here, you will need a multi-system display for it to work properly, as the game is designed to run in that PAL 60 mode. The digital download is compatible with emulators like Stellar, along with the Harmony cartridge. So, if you can't quite justify the physical cartridge costs, there is still a way to allow you to enjoy it on original hardware. Now, Galagon is really the kind of game that will draw you in depending on the type of games player you are. If you're a purist in terms of wanting that Galaga experience, well, there are some great ways to play it, whether legitimate or not, in Space Year 2021. For those with some fondness towards Atari's wood-grained beast, or you're interested in just seeing the technical challenges of how far a 40-something-year-old game system can be pushed, then it's well worth considering. The translation of its core mechanics are done marvellously, feeling just as tight and precise as the original arcade game. Even with the challenges introduced by the lower resolution, making the display a little tight, it is still just as much fun to sit down and play. But when you factor in the inclusion of both the two-player cooperative modes and the challenge mode, you've got something which feels that extra bit special, making for a good reason to come back to it every so often for more than just trying to beat your high score. All up, it makes for something which is darn impressive on so many levels, and shows the keen eye demonstrated by the Champ programming days of the 90s is still on display here, meaning I know I'll be checking out several more of their games in future. And if that is not the sign of a job well done, then honest to goodness, I don't know what is.